The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the mining camp outside Deadwood as Henry Anderson dismounted his exhausted horse. His cavalry boots, still bearing the worn brass spurs from his days as a Confederate officer, kicked up clouds of red dust as he approached the ramshackle assayer's office. 4 years had passed since Appomattox, but the war's weight still hung heavy on his shoulders, along with a more pressing burden, finding his younger brother Frank before it was too late. The assayer, a thin man named Charlie Clark, barely glanced up from his scales as Henry entered. The room smelled of mineral samples and coal smoke from the pot-bellied stove in the corner. Henry placed a crumpled letter on the counter, its edges worn from constant folding and unfolding during his months of searching. Man who wrote this mentioned selling claims here last spring. Name's Frank Anderson? My brother? Charlie studied the letter with rheumy eyes, adjusting the coal oil lamp as sunset's shadows deepened. Anderson. Yeah, I remember him. Came through with some others from Georgia way. Sold 3 silver claims, good ones too. Seemed in an awful hurry if you ask me. Had a nasty burn scar on his left hand. That help identify him? Henry's jaw tightened at the mention of the scar. He remembered the day Frank got it, trying to pull their mother's prized quilts from their burning home after Sherman's troops passed through. That's him, all right. Any idea where he headed after? Been tracking him since March, always 2 steps behind. The desperation in his voice was barely contained. The camp's evening bustle filtered through the office's grimy windows, miners trudging back from their claims, saloon girls beginning their nightly patrols, the distant clang of the Chinese cook's dinner bell at the boarding house. Charlie scratched his gray stubbled chin. Heard talk of him riding with Robert Moore's outfit. They work protection for the mining companies up near Cheyenne. Rough bunch, if rumors are true. Henry's heart sank. Robert Moore's reputation had reached even his ears. A former Union cavalry officer turned mercenary, known for brutal efficiency in handling labor disputes and removing unwanted settlers, especially colored folks trying to homestead. The thought of Frank mixing with such men seemed impossible, yet the war had changed them all in ways he was still discovering. Margaret Taylor, the owner of the boarding house, was wiping down tables when Henry entered. Her eyes, sharp despite her gray hair, took in his trail-worn appearance and Confederate-cut jacket with a single glance. Supper's nearly done, if you're looking to fill your belly before the rush. Her voice carried a hint of Georgia that made Henry's chest ache with memories of home. Over a plate of beans and salt pork, Margaret shared what she knew of Moore's outfit. They're based out of an old army fort in the high country. Local Indians abandoned the whole area after what happened there last winter. Something about spirits angry over spilled blood. Moore's men, they ride at night mostly, always wearing dark clothes, faces covered. Some say they're hunting ghost gold in played-out mines. The next morning found Henry studying a rough map Margaret had drawn, showing the maze of canyons and abandoned mines where Moore's men were said to operate. A young woman named Rachel Clark, Charlie's daughter, approached his table with a fresh pot of coffee. Those men you're asking about, they're not just protecting mines. My friend Laura Moore, Robert's wife, she's scared half to death of what's happening up there. Says they're planning something big. Henry noticed Rachel's hands trembling slightly as she poured. What kind of something? He asked, though part of him dreaded the answer. The war had taught him that men capable of violence rarely limited themselves to just one kind. Rachel glanced nervously at the other breakfast customers before leaning closer. Laura overheard them talking about some sort of night raid, something about teaching lessons to folks who don't know their proper place anymore. She mentioned your brother's name, said he's become Robert's right-hand man these past months. They call him the Ghost because of how he appears and disappears in the dark. Laura's afraid they're going to do something terrible. The food turned to ash in Henry's mouth as he processed Rachel's words. The Frank he knew had been gentle, more interested in books than bullets before the war forced them both to learn violence. What could have happened to transform him into someone who rode with night raiders? The answer, Henry feared, lay in the same darkness that had claimed so many souls during those 4 bloody years. A commotion outside drew Henry to the boarding house window. A group of freed slaves, recently arrived to work the mines, was being turned away by armed men. He recognized the casual cruelty in their stance, the way they fingered their weapons. The same posture he'd seen in men who'd lost their taste for peace. The war wasn't over, he realized. It had just changed locations and targets. As Henry saddled his horse in the pre-dawn darkness the next morning, Margaret approached with a package of provisions. "Your brother," she said softly. "He stayed here when he first arrived. Spoke of you often, how he had to make things right after what happened to your family. But there's different kinds of right in this world, and some of them are wrong clear through. Remember that when you find him." Henry tucked Margaret's provisions into his saddlebag, her warning about his brother echoing in his mind as he guided his horse through the mining camp's muddy streets. The first rays of sunlight painted the mountain peaks in shades of amber and gold, but the valleys remained shrouded in long shadows. Like the war itself, he thought, some darkness lingered long after dawn. The trail leading north toward Deadwood wound through steep terrain, past abandoned claims and half-collapsed mine shafts that dotted the mountainside like empty eye sockets. A cool morning breeze carried the scent of pine and the distant sound of picks striking stone. Henry passed a group of Chinese laborers who averted their eyes, their faces weathered from long days of working exposed to the elements. They'd learned the hard way to make themselves invisible. At a fork in the trail, Henry discovered fresh hoofprints heading east, too many for casual travelers. The tracks told a story of at least 8 riders moving fast, their horses' shoes leaving deep impressions in the soft earth. He'd tracked enough men during the war to read the signs. They were carrying extra weight, probably stolen goods, and one horse was favoring its left foreleg. These details might lead him to the night riders, and possibly to Frank. An abandoned mining office provided shelter for a brief rest around midday. Inside, Henry found scattered papers bearing the letterhead of the Mountain Cross Mining Company. Among them, a partially burned letter caught his attention. It mentioned midnight operations and was signed simply R. The handwriting stirred something in his memory. Robert, a lieutenant who'd served under Frank in their regiment. The connection was too strong to be coincidence. As the afternoon wore on, smoke from a distant campfire drew Henry's attention to a narrow valley. He approached cautiously, dismounting to lead his horse through the dense undergrowth. Voices carried on the wind. Rough men's laughter mixed with the frightened protests of someone being questioned. Henry recognized the cruel edge in their tone, the same he'd heard countless times during prisoner interrogations in the war. Through the trees, he spotted 3 riders wearing dark clothes, their horses ground-tied nearby. They were questioning an elderly black man who'd been working a small claim. The sight made Henry's hand instinctively move to his revolver, but he forced himself to wait and watch. These men might lead him to Frank, but charging in now would only end in bloodshed and lost leads. The miners' camp they'd raided lay just beyond, several tents slashed and supplies scattered across the ground. A young woman, Laura, according to the shouts of her companions, was trying to help an injured man to his feet while keeping her eyes on the armed raiders. Her defiant stance reminded Henry of the battlefield nurses who'd faced down death with similar courage. As Henry watched, one of the raiders produced a document, likely a fraudulent claim notice, and began reading it aloud with mock ceremony. The practice was becoming common, using twisted law to drive legitimate miners from their claims, especially those worked by freed slaves or Chinese laborers. The war's tactics had evolved into something more insidious, wrapped in a thin veneer of legality. The sun was setting when the raiders finally rode out, leaving the destroyed camp behind. Henry waited until they were well away before approaching the miners. Laura was tending to the injured man, using strips torn from her skirt as bandages. When Henry offered help, she initially recoiled, then noticed his Union cavalry jacket and relaxed slightly. "They'll be back," she said grimly. "They always come back." Henry helped the miners salvage what they could, all the while gathering information. The raiders had mentioned meeting others at a place called Devil's Tooth, an old silver mine 3 days' ride toward Cheyenne. More importantly, they'd spoken of their leader, a man they called Captain, who'd once ridden with Mosby's Rangers. The pieces were falling into place, each one drawing Henry closer to his brother, while simultaneously confirming his worst fears about what Frank had become. That night, as Henry made camp in a sheltered draw, he studied the stolen company letter by firelight. The paper crumbled at his touch, but the words remained clear enough. Plans for coordinated raids, targeting specific claims, all under the guise of protecting rightful owners. The war's wounds hadn't healed. They'd just festered beneath the surface, poisoning everything they touched. And somewhere ahead, his brother was at the heart of it all, The mining camp outside Deadwood sprawled across the mountainside like a wound in the earth, mud-streaked tents and rough-hewn cabins scattered between towering pine trees. Henry Anderson dismounted his horse near the camp's edge, his Confederate cavalry boots sinking into the muck as he studied the faces of workers trudging past. 3 weeks of following his brother Frank's trail had led him here, where the Black Hills gold fever had drawn desperate men from across the broken nation. A grizzled prospector named Charlie Moore spat tobacco juice in Henry's direction as he approached. "Another damn Johnny Reb come to hide from what you done," he growled. But there was information to be had rather than a fight. Henry produced a tattered daguerreotype of Frank, taken before the war had hollowed them both. Charlie's roomy eyes narrowed as he studied it, then jerked his head toward the mine entrance. "Fella like that was here a couple weeks back. Worked the night shift with Daniel Clark's crew." The mine shaft plunged into darkness, support timbers groaning under the mountain's weight. Henry's lantern cast dancing shadows as he followed the rail tracks deeper, the air growing thick with coal dust and the remnants of blasting powder. He found Daniel Clark supervising a crew of Chinese laborers, their faces streaked with grime as they attacked the rock face with picks. The foreman was a bull-necked man with dead eyes, but he remembered Frank Anderson well enough. "Your brother had the devil's own luck at cards," Clark said, leading Henry through a maze of tunnels. "Won big off Robert Taylor one night. Next morning, both of them was gone. Taylor's wife Susan, too. Word is they headed for Cheyenne, looking to start some kind of organization for folk who ain't ready to let the war end." Henry's jaw tightened at the implications. He'd seen enough Night Rider violence during Reconstruction to recognize the signs. In the cramped boarding house that evening, Henry pieced together more of Frank's movements from Margaret Moore, the widow who ran the place. She spoke of heated arguments between Frank and Robert Taylor, whispered conversations about preserving the old ways and teaching them their place. But it was Laura Walker, a young freedwoman working in the kitchen, who provided the most chilling details about the masked men who'd begun appearing in nearby settlements. "They call themselves the Brothers of the Righteous Cause," Laura said softly, her hands trembling as she poured coffee. "Burning homes, hanging folks who speak up for colored rights. Your brother, he has a way of talking that makes men follow him, makes them believe burning and killing is God's work." Henry saw the terror in her eyes, remembered similar fear in Georgia after the surrender. The war had broken something in Frank, turned righteousness to poison. Word spread through camp about Henry's questions, drawing out those with stories to tell. Rachel Taylor, Robert's sister, spoke of how her brother and Frank had recruited among bitter Confederate veterans, promising a chance to restore proper order. Martha Clark described meetings in the mine tunnels, where masked men practiced military drill by lantern light. Each account pointed toward Cheyenne and a growing storm of violence. As Henry prepared to ride out, Charlie Moore caught him at the stables. The old prospector's earlier hostility had faded to something like concern. "Your brother, he ain't just leading night riders. He's building himself an army. Got runners bringing in guns, ammunition, planning something big come spring thaw." He pressed a crude map into Henry's hands, marking the locations of reported attacks. The pattern was clear, systematic terror radiating out from Cheyenne. In his tent that final night, Henry studied Frank's photograph by lamplight, searching his brother's face for signs of the darkness to come. The war had changed them both, but while Henry had found his way back to something like peace, Frank had embraced the savage logic of violence. Tomorrow he would ride for Cheyenne, no longer seeking to rescue his brother but to stop him. The thought sat like lead in his gut as he cleaned his revolver with practiced care. Dawn broke cold and gray over the mining camp as Henry mounted up. Laura Walker appeared with a package of trail provisions, her eyes solemn. "There are good folks in Cheyenne who'll help you," she said. "People who've lost kin to the brothers. Find Margaret Anderson at the Silver Dollar. She knows their movements." Henry touched his hat brim in thanks, nudged his horse toward the trail. Behind him, the mine swallowed another shift of workers into its depths as he rode west, following his brother's bloody trail toward judgment. The trail to Cheyenne wound through jagged peaks still crowned with late spring snow. Henry's mind drifted to the intelligence reports he'd studied during the war. Dispatches describing guerrilla bands that moved like ghosts through mountain passes much like these. Frank had commanded such a unit, earning a reputation for ruthless efficiency that made even hardened veterans uneasy. Now those same tactics were being turned against innocent freedmen, and Henry couldn't shake the feeling that his brother had found a way to keep fighting a war that should have ended at Appomattox. As the elevation dropped and the pine forests thinned, Henry spotted smoke rising from a homestead nestled in a narrow valley. Drawing closer, he saw the scorched remains of a barn, still smoldering in the morning air. An elderly black man sat on the cabin's front steps, shotgun across his knees. When Henry dismounted, the man's weathered face remained impassive, but his grip tightened on the weapon. "I'm looking for information about the brothers," Henry said, keeping his hands visible. "A group of riders causing trouble in these parts." The old man studied him for a long moment before nodding toward the cabin door. "Talk to Daniel inside. He saw them clear as day when they came through last week." The name triggered a memory. Daniel had been mentioned in Laura's letters describing the escalating violence. Inside the cabin, a younger man sat at a rough-hewn table, arm-bound in a blood-stained bandage. His eyes held the haunted look Henry had seen too often during the war. Daniel described an attack by masked riders, led by a man whose commanding presence and tactical precision spoke of military training. "He gave orders like an officer," Daniel said. "Made them move with discipline, not just random violence. Called him captain, they did." The familiar weight of dread settled in Henry's stomach. He'd seen Frank deploy similar tactics during the war, coordinated attacks that left victims reeling but infrastructure intact, ensuring future targets remained viable. This wasn't mere banditry or post-war resentment. It was systematic terror designed to drive freedmen from lands they'd legally claimed. As Henry rode on, the spring sunshine felt hollow against his face. Near sunset, he encountered a mining supply wagon headed toward Cheyenne. The driver, an old prospector named Charlie, offered to share his fire for the night. Over coffee and salt pork, Charlie spoke of increasing tension in town. The brothers had been pressing local businesses to refuse service to freed slaves, backing their demands with nighttime visits that left buildings damaged and people frightened. "Strange thing is," Charlie said, poking at the fire, "some folks whisper they've got friends in high places. Sheriff barely investigates anymore, and Judge Roberts suddenly started throwing out cases against known night riders." Henry filed away the information, wondering how deep his brother's influence might reach. Frank had always been clever at building networks of loyalty and obligation. The next morning brought Henry within sight of Cheyenne's outskirts. Smoke from cook fires and foundries hung in the valley like a shroud, and he could make out the dark shapes of mine headframes dotting the hillsides. Somewhere in that maze of streets and claims, Frank was building something dangerous. Not just a gang, but a movement that could spread like wildfire through the unstable territory. Henry touched the pocket holding Frank's photograph, remembering Laura's words about Margaret Anderson at the Silver Dollar. He would need allies to navigate the web his brother had woven. More than that, he would need proof. Evidence that would convince authorities to act against a man who likely had half the town in his pocket. The revolver at his hip felt heavier with each passing mile, its presence a constant reminder that gathering evidence might not be enough. As he rode down into Cheyenne proper, Henry caught glimpses of the tension Charlie had described. Armed men lounged on street corners, watching passers-by with predatory intent. A group of freedmen hurried past with heads down, while white townspeople looked away. This was Frank's handiwork, not just violence, but the fear that lingered in its wake, poisoning everything it touched. Henry straightened in his saddle, mind already working through next steps. Finding Margaret Anderson would be just the beginning. The Silver Dollar Saloon loomed at the end of Cheyenne's main street, its weathered facade a stark contrast to the polished brass fixtures visible through grimy windows. Henry dismounted, taking care to secure his horse where he could keep an eye on it through the front windows. Experience had taught him that a man's enemies often struck at his means of escape first. Inside, the late afternoon sun filtered through tobacco-stained glass, catching dust motes that danced above scarred wooden tables. A few miners nursed drinks in dark corners, their faces shadowed by coal residue that even vigorous washing couldn't fully remove. At the bar, a woman in her 40s methodically polished glasses, her movements precise and purposeful. Her graying hair was pulled back severely, but her eyes held a sharp intelligence that surveyed the room constantly. Margaret Anderson? Henry approached the bar carefully, noting how the woman's hand drifted beneath the counter. Laura sends her regards. The hand stilled, and Margaret's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. She studied him for a long moment before nodding toward a door near the back. The late autumn wind howled through the steep mountain passes outside Deadwood as Henry Anderson crouched behind a massive boulder, his Winchester rifle held tight against his chest. Below him, torchlit figures moved between the rough-hewn buildings of the Lucky Strike mine camp. He'd tracked his brother Frank's gang to this remote outpost after following a trail of violence across 3 territories. The Night Riders had been terrorizing freed slaves who'd found work in the region's mines, and Henry's heart ached knowing his own blood led these attacks. Through his field glasses, Henry watched as masked men emerged from the mine office, dragging 2 African-American miners behind them. His jaw clenched at the sight of the familiar figure directing the others. Frank's distinctive limp from his old war wound was unmistakable, even in the flickering torchlight. 6 months of searching had led to this moment. But Henry found no joy in finally locating his younger brother. The mountain air grew colder as Henry carefully picked his way down the rocky slope, staying in the shadows. He'd befriended a freed slave named Daniel Clark in Cheyenne, who'd lost his brother to Frank's gang, and Daniel's words echoed in his mind. Sometimes family ain't about blood. It's about doing what's right. Henry had promised to stop Frank's reign of terror, whatever the cost. The weight of that vow pressed down on him like the tons of rock above the mine shafts below. Inside the camp, Rachel Moore worked as a cook, secretly gathering intelligence about the Night Riders' activities. She'd been Henry's eyes and ears for weeks, risking her life to pass information through elaborate dead drops. Tonight's raid wasn't a surprise. She'd managed to warn him it was coming. But the scale of Frank's operation had grown beyond what either of them had imagined. At least 30 armed men now called Frank their leader. The screams of the captured miners carried across the valley as Frank's men dragged them toward the mine entrance. Henry knew he had to act fast. These Night Riders had developed a cruel pattern of forcing their victims deep into abandoned shafts before causing cave-ins. His finger tightened on the trigger as he drew a bead on the nearest torchbearer, but he forced himself to wait. A single shot would bring the whole gang down on him before he could reach Frank. Rachel had told him about a back entrance to the mine, a narrow shaft that connected to the main tunnels. While Frank's men were occupied with their victims at the main entrance, Henry could slip in undetected and work his way through the honeycombed passages to cut them off. The thought of entering those dark tunnels made his skin crawl, but he had no choice. He'd seen too many innocent people die while tracking his brother across the frontier. As Henry crept toward the hidden mine entrance, memories of their childhood in Virginia flooded back, Frank following him everywhere, looking up to his big brother with hero worship in his eyes. The war had changed them both, but while Henry had found a way to move forward, Frank had twisted his pain into hatred. The Night Riders gave him purpose, but it was a purpose built on cruelty and fear. Henry couldn't let it continue. The narrow shaft was barely wide enough for Henry to squeeze through with his rifle. The musty air grew thick as he descended, guided only by the faint glow of phosphorescent fungi clinging to the damp walls. He could hear echoing voices ahead, Frank's men forcing their captives deeper into the mine. Henry moved as quickly as he dared, counting his steps to maintain his bearings in the darkness. One wrong turn could leave him lost forever in this underground maze. After what felt like hours but was likely only minutes, Henry spotted torchlight reflecting off the tunnel walls ahead. He eased forward until he could make out Frank's voice giving orders to his men. "Take them to the south shaft. Make sure it looks like an accident." The words were spoken with such casual cruelty that Henry barely recognized his brother's voice. The idealistic young man who'd once dreamed of becoming a doctor was truly gone. Henry emerged into a larger chamber just as Frank's men were binding the miners' hands. In the improved light, he could see the terror in their eyes. One was barely more than a boy, probably no older than Frank had been when he first put on a Confederate uniform. Henry raised his rifle and called out, "That's far enough, Frank." The Night Riders spun toward him, reaching for weapons, but Henry's aim remained steady on his brother's chest. Frank's face showed no surprise at Henry's appearance, only contempt. "I wondered when you'd catch up to me, big brother. Come to lecture me about right and wrong. The war taught me there's no such thing. There's only power in those too weak to take it." His hand inched toward his holster as he spoke. "Walk away, Henry. This isn't your fight. You made it my fight when you started murdering innocent people," Henry replied, his voice heavy with sorrow. I've followed your trail of bodies across 3 territories. It ends here." He saw the decision in Frank's eyes a split second before his brother went for his gun. Henry's rifle cracked once, the sound deafening in the confined space. Frank stumbled backward, a look of disbelief crossing his face as he slid down the rough wall, leaving a crimson streak behind him. The other night, riders opened fire, forcing Henry to dive behind a support beam as bullets splintered the wood around him. He picked his shots carefully in the chaos, not wanting to hit the bound miners. Through the gun smoke, he saw Rachel appear from a side tunnel with Daniel Clark and several armed men, the backup plan they'd arranged if things went wrong. The night riders found themselves caught in a crossfire. The battle was brief but brutal in the confined space. When the echoes of gunfire finally faded, Henry knelt beside his brother's body. Frank's eyes were already growing dim, but his lips moved slightly. Henry leaned close to catch his final words. "You always were." Too soft. Then he was gone. Henry closed his brother's eyes, his own vision blurring with tears he refused to let fall. Sometimes doing right meant carrying a burden that would never fully heal. Later, as dawn broke over the mountains, Henry stood with Rachel and Daniel watching the surviving night riders being led away in chains. The freed miners had been rescued, and Frank's reign of terror was over. But Henry felt no triumph, only a bone-deep weariness and the hollow ache of loss. Rachel touched his arm gently. "You did what had to be done," she said softly. Henry nodded, knowing she was right, but wishing there had been another way. The morning sun cast long shadows across the mining camp as Henry helped the freed workers gather what remained of their belongings. Each face bore the marks of hardship, but there was a newfound hope in their eyes that made the weight of what he'd done a little more bearable. Daniel organized teams to dismantle the night riders' camp, while Rachel tended to those who'd been injured in the firefight. The mountain air was crisp with autumn's approaching chill, carrying the scent of pine and gun smoke. Henry found himself drawn to Frank's tent, searching for answers among his brother's possessions. Inside, he discovered a leather-bound journal filled with detailed plans and correspondence that revealed the full scope of Frank's operation. The night riders hadn't just been terrorizing freed slaves. They'd been building a network across the territory, using the chaos of Reconstruction to seize control of mines and railroad stations. The names of conspirators filled pages, including several prominent citizens in Cheyenne who'd backed Frank's activities. Rachel joined him as he studied the documents, her medical bag still in hand. "Those could help bring down the entire organization," she observed quietly. Henry nodded, his throat tight. The brother he'd spent months searching for had been building an empire of terror, while Henry had clung to memories of the young man who'd once defended him from schoolyard bullies. The truth was a bitter pill, but he knew what needed to be done. Daniel gathered the surviving miners around the camp's main fire, where Martha served hot coffee and whatever food could be salvaged from the storehouse. The old woman had been the camp's cook, forced to serve Frank's men, but secretly helping the imprisoned workers whenever possible. Now she moved among them freely, her weathered face bright with relief as she filled cups and offered quiet words of comfort to those who'd lost friends in the fighting. The decision to ride for Cheyenne came easily. Henry knew the evidence in Frank's journal could prevent others from following his brother's dark path. Rachel insisted on accompanying him. Her medical skills might still be needed, and Daniel volunteered to guide them through the mountain passes. The freed workers would follow once they'd regained their strength, many planning to testify about their ordeal. As they prepared their horses, Henry caught sight of a crude wooden cross marking a fresh grave near the mine entrance. One of the workers, an elderly man named Robert, stood beside it with head bowed. Henry approached slowly, recognizing the name carved into the wood. Charlie, the young miner who'd first told them about Frank's operation before succumbing to his injuries, another debt that could never truly be repaid. The journey to Cheyenne would take several days through treacherous terrain. Henry secured Frank's journal inside his coat, feeling its weight like a stone against his heart. Rachel rode beside him as they left the mining camp, her presence a steady reminder that not all family ties were bound by blood. Sometimes the family you chose proved stronger than the one you were born to. Behind them, the mountain mining camp grew small against the vast landscape. Ahead lay Cheyenne, and the task of ensuring Frank's legacy of hatred died with him. Henry touched the journal again, remembering his brother's final words. Perhaps Frank had been right. Henry was too soft to follow the path of violence and revenge. But as they rode toward justice, he realized that softness wasn't weakness. It was the strength to choose a better way, even when that choice broke your heart. The setting sun painted the mountain peaks in shades of gold and shadow as their small group made camp for the first night. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, Henry allowed himself to rest beside the fire, listening to Daniel's quiet stories of the territory's better days and Rachel's gentle humming as she tended their horses. The burden he carried would never fully lift, but he wasn't carrying it alone. The old mining camp outside Deadwood loomed before Henry Anderson like a graveyard of broken dreams, its weathered shacks and rusted equipment casting long shadows in the fading light. After months of searching, the trail had led him here, to this desolate place where his brother Frank's transformation from respected soldier to murderous night rider would finally come to its bitter end. The creaking of timber in the wind reminded Henry of nooses swaying, a fitting sound for what lay ahead. Through his field glasses, Henry counted at least 20 men moving between the buildings, their faces hidden behind dark kerchiefs. His brother's band had grown. Among them, he recognized Daniel Clark, a former cavalry sergeant who'd served under Frank during the war. The sight of these Confederate veterans turned criminals made Henry's stomach turn. They'd fought for a lost cause, but this, terrorizing freed men and women, was something far darker. Susan Taylor stood beside Henry on the ridge, her rifle ready. The schoolteacher had joined his hunt after night riders burned her schoolhouse in Cheyenne, killing 3 of her students. "Your brother's in the main office," she whispered, pointing to a larger structure with a tin roof. "I saw him go in an hour ago." Henry nodded, grateful for her steady presence. She understood what had to be done. The memories of their childhood in Virginia flooded back, Frank teaching him to ride, to shoot, to be brave. But the war had broken something in his older brother, twisted his sense of justice into a crusade of hate. The reports Henry had gathered painted a clear picture. Frank Anderson had become a monster, leading raids that left dozens dead across 3 territories. Their family name was now spoken with fear and loathing. As darkness settled over the camp, Henry watched torch-bearing riders return from another raid. Their whoops of victory made his blood run cold. Through his glasses, he saw them dragging something. No, someone. A black man in chains, barely conscious. Henry's hand tightened on his rifle. Whatever lingering doubt he had about confronting his brother vanished. This had to end tonight. Susan touched his arm gently. "The miners will help us," she whispered. "Most are freedmen who've been living in terror. They're ready to fight back." Henry saw movement in the shadows, dozens of dark figures emerging from hidden shelters in the surrounding hills. These men had survived slavery only to face a new kind of oppression. Tonight, they would stand against their tormentors. The attack began with explosive charges in the mine shafts, Susan's idea. As panic erupted in the camp, Henry led a group of miners toward the main office while others engaged the night riders. Gunfire erupted across the valley, the muzzle flashes painting stark tableaus of violence. He saw Daniel Clark fall, clutching a bloody chest, his final expression one of surprise. Inside the office, Frank stood calmly behind a desk, as if expecting this moment. "Little brother," he said, his voice eerily gentle. "Still trying to save me?" The lamplight caught the silver in his hair, reminding Henry of their father. But the eyes were different now, cold and empty. "The war never ended for me, Henry. These people need to learn their place. Join us. Help restore what was lost." "Nothing was lost that deserved keeping," Henry replied, his voice steady despite the ache in his heart. "You taught me about honor, Frank. About protecting the weak. What happened to that man?" Frank's hand moved toward his gun, and Henry saw their whole lives flash before him. Every shared laugh, every proud moment, every dream of glory. But the man before him now was a stranger wearing his brother's face. The shootout was brief but violent. Frank was still fast, but Henry had always been the better shot. As his brother lay dying, Henry cradled him, remembering how Frank had once held him after he fell from his first horse. "I'm sorry," Frank whispered, blood on his lips. "I lost my way." Outside, the night riders were surrendering or fleeing into the darkness. The reign of terror was ending, but victory felt hollow. Dawn found Henry and Susan helping the freed miners bury the dead. Among the fallen night riders, he recognized faces from his Confederate past, men who'd chosen hate over healing. The surviving raiders would face justice in Deadwood, though Henry knew no punishment could restore what had been lost. He buried Frank on a hillside facing east, marking the grave with a simple wooden cross. As they prepared to leave, Susan took his hand. "What will you do now?" she asked. Henry looked at the miners rebuilding their community, free at last from fear. "There's more work to be done," he said. "More people who need help finding their way back from darkness." Together they rode toward Deadwood, leaving behind both a graveyard and a birthplace of something new, a small piece of justice in a wounded land. The story of the Anderson brothers would be told for years in mining camps and frontier towns, a tale of how the Civil War's poison lingered in men's souls and how sometimes the hardest battles were fought not against enemies, but against the darkness in those we love. Henry never returned to that valley, but he carried its lessons with him. That true courage meant standing against wrong, even when wrong wore a familiar face. The seasons turned as Henry and Susan made their way through the mining camps of the Black Hills, helping where they could. Word spread of a lawman who understood both justice and mercy, who could tell the difference between men lost to darkness and those who chose it willingly. In Deadwood's muddy streets, Henry found purpose beyond vengeance, using the skills that had once made him a feared cavalry officer to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Susan proved an unexpected anchor, her quiet strength helping him navigate the aftermath of having to end his own brother's life. She understood the weight he carried, having lost her own family to violence years before. Together they built something neither had expected to find in the shadow of tragedy, a partnership forged in shared purpose rather than shared blood. In the spring, they received word from Martha, one of Frank's former victims, who'd established a school for freed children in Cheyenne. Her letter spoke of night riders appearing again in Wyoming territory, wearing familiar masks. Henry recognized the pattern. Other lost souls following Frank's dark path, unable to let go of old hatreds. He knew then that his work wasn't finished. Before leaving Deadwood, Henry visited the assayer's office where he'd first picked up Frank's trail. The old man remembered him, offered a weathered smile. "Heard about what happened with your brother," he said. "Can't imagine having to make that choice." Henry touched the badge he now wore. "Sometimes the hardest choices are the only right ones," he replied. The journey to Cheyenne took them through lands transformed by the railroad's advance. Where buffalo had roamed 3 years earlier, settlements sprouted like prairie flowers after rain. Yet the old wounds festered beneath progress's facade. In each town, Henry found echoes of the conflict that had claimed Frank. Men who couldn't accept that the world had changed, who clung to violence as if it could turn back time. Susan's medical skills proved as valuable as Henry's gun. They stopped in mining camps where children coughed from coal dust, in settlements where former slaves and Confederate veterans lived side by side in uneasy peace. She healed bodies while Henry worked to heal deeper wounds, showing by example that cooperation offered more hope than conflict. Martha's school sat on Cheyenne's outskirts, a beacon of possibility in troubled times. The night riders had threatened but not yet attacked, perhaps sensing that this target would fight back. Henry helped organize the townspeople, black and white, immigrant and native-born, into a defense force. Susan trained the women to shoot, remembering her own lessons in self-reliance. When the raiders finally came, they found not helpless victims but a community united against terror. The battle was brief but fierce. Henry faced down their leader, a man he recognized from his Confederate days. "The war's over, Daniel," he called out. "Let it rest." For a moment he saw Frank in the other man's eyes, that same desperate clinging to a lost cause. But unlike Frank, Daniel chose to lower his weapon. In the aftermath, as dawn painted the mountains gold, Henry watched former enemies help each other tend wounds and rebuild damaged buildings. He thought of Frank's grave, facing east toward a sunrise his brother would never see. Some men, he realized, could find their way back from darkness. Others had to be stopped before they pulled more souls into shadow. Susan found him on the school's porch, where children's laughter had replaced the sound of gunfire. "You're thinking about Frank," she said. Henry nodded. "Wondering if I could have saved him." She took his hand, her touch grounding him in the present. "You did save him," she said. You kept him from becoming something even worse. Together they watched the sun climb higher, casting long shadows that gradually shortened with the day's advance. Henry understood now that his search for Frank had led him to a different kind of family, one built on choice rather than blood, on shared values rather than shared past. The West was changing, and he would help guide that change toward justice, one small victory at a time. As autumn approached, they received more calls for help from distant settlements. Each time, Henry answered, carrying with him the hard wisdom earned in that mountain valley. He had set out to save his brother and ended up finding a greater purpose, helping others choose light over darkness, reconciliation over revenge. It wasn't the ending he'd expected, but it was the one the country needed.